You're listening to In the Balance, an Iowa Judicial Branch podcast. Welcome back. This month, I spoke with Richard Lyford, who has worked with the Iowa Judicial Branch over the past 20 years to collect and record personal oral histories from past Iowa Supreme Court justices and judges. To learn more about his work preserving Iowa's judicial history, keep listening. Thank you for taking the time to join me today, Richard. Tell me a bit about how you came to work in connection with the Iowa Judicial Branch.
Sure. Well, I began this work with my involvement really with the Historical Society for the United States Court in the Eighth Circuit, the federal courts in Iowa. I went to a Southern District of Iowa branch meeting in the mid-90s, and it was headed by the president and a guy named Dick Peterson, who was a magistrate judge from Council Bluffs and a World War II veteran who had served as a U.S. commissioner before he was a magistrate. So he was the longest serving such officer in the federal court system. Really a very interesting guy. Judge William Stewart was what I call the godfather of the thing. He was overseeing it, had a great interest in preserving history of the courts in Iowa. He was on the Iowa Supreme Court before he was appointed to the federal bench. And I went to these annual meetings for a while, and the secretary was a woman named Bess Osenbaugh, who went to Iowa Law School. She was a couple of years ahead of me, and then went down and taught at the University of Arkansas Law School when the Clintons were there. And when Bill Clinton became president, she got invited to go to the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and so they needed a secretary, and I ended up being the secretary. Then when Dick retired, he asked me if I'd be the president. I think I was sort of the only person around, so he kind of asked me to do this. So as I became president of the Southern District of Iowa branch of the Eighth Circuit Historical Society, I was then given the task to do some interviews of retired judges, and I did a couple of those that came along, but soon realized that there's nobody doing this on the state court side, and there was a huge pool of people who had good stories to tell, but really didn't have anybody to tell them to. And so I started looking at that, and in 2004, Mark Harding, who is a lawyer here in Des Moines, has a great video system, 2-camera system for taking depositions, volunteered his services to do oral histories with me. And so in 2004, we started doing these. First with, we thought we'd start with the oldest and the chief justices first. So we started really with Art McGivern in Ottumwa and Ford Reynoldson in Osceola. So we had those two to come up with first, and we did those in 2004. And that kind of got us going, and that's how we got involved in the process. Since then, we've done 18 Supreme Court justices, a couple of Court of Appeals judges, and some district court judges. So that's how it all began.
Amazing. Almost 20 years now, then.
Yes, we've been doing it for 20 years, Marissa.
Amazing. And the tables have kind of turned in this podcast episode. You, the interviewer, now the interviewee. But can you tell me a bit about how you prepare for your interviews?
Well, what I try to do, first of all, is to get somebody else to be the interviewer, not because I don't like to do them. I do, and I have done several, but I try to get somebody who I'd call to be a friend or a contemporary, so that the style of the interview is conversational and friendly. Not I wouldn't call it lighthearted, but at least light, and so that there's somebody like that. I don't want it to be stilted. But if I do them, I try to go to Westlaw and print out the cases that are involved with the interviewee and look at them to see how they're doing. And then I have a sort of an outline that I share with the interviewee to tell, go over what it is I think were important, and then try to talk to them about anything they'd like to say or what they don't want to say. Some of them are reluctant to include families because for security reasons, or they just don't think it's appropriate and they want to keep it involved in the legal side of things. So I try to go with what the interviewee's story is. This is the interviewee's story, and I want them to be able to tell it in the way they'd like it have told.
Absolutely. And has the process or final product changed much over the years in comparison to some of the first interviews you prepared for?
Oh, yes. I've gotten a lot better, I hope. That's one thing. I've learned a lot in the process. I was kind of how do I say this? I just dropped into this process, and I've learned a lot. The first thing is, the interviewer should talk only about 20% of the time. The other part has to be the interviewee. You want it to be their story. So that was what I've tried to do throughout the whole process. And if I think an interviewer is not adhering to that, I try to give some subtle hints about, how do you think we ought to be doing this? The other thing is the technical part of this. We started out with doing DVD discs, which I thought were kind of neat and looked good, but they don't do the high resolution that we do now. So we've switched to thumb drives, and we do a 4K kind of digital process now that really looks much better. But much of the early ones were done, I must say, with a lower resolution, and they don't look as good. I've tried to improve the sound. We've tried to change the camera setup so that when the interviewer asks a question, both the interviewer and the interviewee are on camera, and then when the interviewee answers, the interviewee is the one on camera. So we switch back and forth. I don't like one camera interviews because they sort of look like prisoner of war interrogations, and I try to avoid that. Although one of these I did is in 2007. I went out to Bellingham, Washington, and did Frank Becker. Frank Becker was a Supreme Court justice back in the 70s. He was one of the first Democrats that got appointed after the 1964 election, and I had to use a court reporter there. And we just did a one-camera interview. But the rest of them have been I've tried to do better with and get more involvement.
And after 20 years of interviewing Supreme Court justices, is there a common thread or story or motivation you have seen amongst those who make it to either Iowa's highest bench or the federal bench?
Service is the big one. All of them have given a great service. I would say that on the state court side, the merit selection system forms what I'd call ambition. Many of the people who ultimately make it to the Supreme Court were nominated several times, and they go through the process several times. So you can't be discouraged. That's sort of a common thread that's been through. I've done through these. They stick in there and get it, and they realize that the people who do get appointed, when they lose, if that's the word, don't get nominated, are always good choices, because the merit selection system makes sure that the governor always has a couple of really good people to choose from. So they aren't embarrassed by not making it. So that, I think, helps them do it more than that. So they really have ambition, but at the same time, it's the merit selection system creates forms that ambition of people who have good credentials and are not afraid to talk to the commission more than once.
And are there any stories that you've heard in your interviews that have surprised you?
I wouldn't say I was surprised. Most of the stories I get, I understand because I've been around so long. But what I do find interesting is the wisdom of particularly those who have served as trial court judges. The wisdom that they have gained through the years lets them do, how do I say this, lets them make really good decisions and cut through the efforts of lawyers that are trying to obfuscate and really not get to the heart of the matter. I could give some examples, but I don't want to take a lot of your time doing that. But they all have. But there have been some really very wise people on the court, and they've made wise decisions after they've been there a while and gotten some really good experience.
And lastly, what do you hope the people of Iowa take away from your video interviews?
Well, I hope they take away a real sense of respect for the people and the process that Iowa has. I think the Iowa merit selection system brings forward really good people through the process. It winnows down till you get some people with really good credentials who are not only wise, intelligent, willing to work hard, but have a great sense of duty to the system. And I think our system may not be perfect, but it's really done a lot to create, I think, one of the best judicial systems and pool of judges in the country.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Richard.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for letting me do this. I really, really have enjoyed it.
You've been listening to In the Balance, an Iowa Judicial Branch podcast, hosted and produced by Marissa Gaal. If you would like more information about Iowa's courts, you can visit www.iowacourts.gov. You can also follow the Iowa Judicial Branch on Twitter and YouTube at Iowa Courts. This episode of In the Balance is now adjourned.